She almost canceled the blind date the moment she saw him. Across the elegant dining room, where crystal chandeliers scattered warm light over polished marble, and every table seemed occupied by people dressed for success, Ethan Brooks stood awkwardly near the entrance in a neatly pressed but obviously outdated navy suit. His shoes had been polished until they shined, yet the worn leather still revealed years of use. A pair of wealthy businessmen glanced at him before exchanging amused smiles. One whispered loudly enough for nearby guests to hear, "The matchmaking agency must be desperate if they're pairing Victoria Sterling with a guy who looks like he fixes fences for a living." Quiet laughter drifted through the restaurant. Victoria Sterling, billionaire founder and CEO of Sterling Dynamics, lowered her eyes for a brief second. She had endured years of blind dates arranged by friends, board members, and even her mother before she passed away. Every man had tried to impress her with private jets, investment portfolios, luxury yachts, or promises of expanding her empire. Looking at Ethan now, she assumed this evening would end within 15 minutes. She even reached for her phone, considering a polite excuse to leave before the introductions were made. But before she could stand, something unexpected happened. An elderly waitress carrying a tray of hot coffee stumbled as another customer backed into her. Cups shattered across the polished floor. Scalding coffee splashed onto the old woman's trembling hands. The room froze for a heartbeat before several guests frowned in irritation, worried more about their expensive shoes than the frightened waitress. One impatient diner snapped, "Someone clean this mess up." Another sighed dramatically, rolling his eyes as if compassion had become an inconvenience. Ethan moved before anyone else did. Without hesitation, he knelt on the broken glass, ignoring the sharp edges pressing against his knees. He took off his own jacket, wrapped it gently around the waitress's burned hands, and spoke with a calm voice so soft that only those closest could hear. "Ma'am, accidents happen. Please don't apologize for being human." The old woman's eyes filled with tears. Ethan helped her collect the broken cups, while quietly reassuring her that everything would be all right. When the restaurant manager hurried over, clearly preparing to scold the waitress, Ethan accepted responsibility instead, insisting the accident had happened because he had stepped in her path, though everyone nearby knew that wasn't true. The room grew strangely quiet. Victoria watched him from across the restaurant, unable to explain the feeling settling inside her chest. For years, she had sat across from powerful men who demanded admiration before offering kindness. This stranger possessed neither wealth nor status, yet had instinctively protected someone who could do absolutely nothing for him. When Ethan finally approached her table, he smiled with quiet humility instead of nervous ambition. "I'm sorry I'm a few minutes late," he said. "I just didn't think she should have to cry alone tonight." Victoria slowly closed the phone she had intended to use as an excuse to leave. For the first time in longer than she could remember, she wanted the evening to continue. She had arrived expecting to evaluate another man. She had no idea she was about to meet the first person who would quietly change everything she believed about success, love, and the true measure of a human heart. Ethan Brooks sat down across from Victoria Sterling as if he had no idea he was facing one of the most powerful women in America, and somehow that made him more dangerous to her guarded heart than any billionaire she had ever met. He did not scan the room to see who was watching. He did not compliment the diamonds at her throat or pretend to recognize the designer of her black evening dress. He simply unfolded his napkin, placed it on his lap, and gave her a small, honest smile. "I'm Ethan," he said, "and I should probably warn you, I'm not very good at these things." Victoria arched an eyebrow. "Blind dates, expensive restaurants," he replied, glancing at the silverware. "There are too many forks, and I'm fairly sure one of them is just here to judge me." Against her will, Victoria laughed. Not the polite laugh she used in boardrooms, not the controlled smile she gave investors, but a Real laugh, sudden and unpolished. It surprised them both. The waiter arrived, and Ethan quietly ordered the cheapest entree on the menu without making it obvious. Victoria noticed. She noticed everything, but she also noticed how he asked the waiter's name, thanked him with eye contact, and moved his water glass slightly so the young man would not have to reach awkwardly across the table. Small things, human things, things her world rarely valued because they could not be counted, acquired, or displayed. So Victoria said, studying him, "What do you do, Ethan?" He did not puff up. He did not shrink. "I build things. Mostly cabinets, porches, repairs. Sometimes furniture when people still believe old wood is worth saving." "And do you believe that?" He looked at her then, really looked, with eyes tired enough to know loss and gentle enough not to pass it on. "I think most things are worth saving if someone has the patience to see what they used to be." The words landed quietly between them. Victoria lowered her gaze to the candle flickering beside her untouched wine. She had spent years building a company from a dying inheritance into a $12 billion empire, yet no one had ever spoken to her about patience, restoration, or worth without turning it into a business metaphor. Ethan asked her nothing about money, nothing about her title, nothing about why a woman like her was alone in a restaurant on a Friday night. Instead, he asked, "When was the last time you had a whole day where nobody needed anything from you?" Victoria's fingers stilled around her glass. 3 quick answers rose to her lips and died there. "I don't remember," she admitted. Outside, rain began tapping against the tall windows, soft at first, then steady, turning the city lights into trembling gold. Ethan nodded, not with pity, but with understanding. "That sounds heavy." She expected advice. Men always gave advice when silence would have been kinder. But Ethan only let the quiet breathe. Across the room, the businessmen who had mocked him earlier kept watching, waiting for the date to collapse. Instead, they saw Victoria Sterling lean forward as if the broke single dad in the worn suit had become the only person in the room who could hear the part of her that had been lonely for years. For a while, neither of them noticed that dinner had arrived. The plates rested untouched between them, while the conversation drifted somewhere far away from careers, fortunes, and first impressions. Ethan spoke about rebuilding an old farmhouse after a tornado had nearly erased it from the map, describing how the strongest beams were never the newest ones, but the ones that had survived the hardest winters. Victoria listened with unusual attention, realizing he talked about houses the way philosophers talked about people. She found herself asking questions she normally never asked anyone. "Do you ever regret it?" she said quietly. "Living in a small town, working so hard just to get by." Ethan smiled faintly, turning his coffee cup between his hands. "Every Monday morning," he joked, earning another genuine laugh from her. Then his expression softened. "But every evening I go home, my daughter runs to the front door like I've been gone for years. After that, regret doesn't have much room left." Victoria felt something tighten in her chest. She had attended global conferences, stood on stages before thousands of employees, negotiated billion-dollar mergers across 3 continents. Yet she couldn't remember the last time someone had spoken about success without mentioning numbers. Ethan didn't seem interested in measuring life by income or prestige. He measured it by moments. "Tell me about Lily," Victoria asked. The change in Ethan was immediate. His tired eyes brightened with quiet pride. He pulled out his aging phone, its case scratched from years of use, and showed her a photograph of a little girl with messy brown curls, missing one front tooth, proudly holding a handmade birdhouse covered in crooked paint. She insisted blue birds deserve blue houses, he laughed. "I didn't have the heart to explain that birds usually don't care about color." Victoria smiled at the picture longer than she expected. "She's beautiful." Ethan nodded. "She gets that from her mother." A gentle silence settled over the table. Victoria sensed there was a story hidden behind those few words, but unlike everyone else in her world, she didn't interrupt it with curiosity. Ethan appreciated that. After a moment, he continued on his own. "Emily passed away 7 years ago. Cancer. Lily was only one." He said it without bitterness. Almost as though grief had become a companion he had finally learned to walk beside instead of fight against. Victoria lowered her eyes. "I'm sorry." Ethan gave a small shake of his head. "So am I. But if loving someone that deeply meant eventually losing them, I'd still choose her every single time." The sentence lingered in the warm candlelight long after he finished speaking. Victoria suddenly understood why there was such calm in this ordinary man. It wasn't because life had spared him pain. It was because pain had never managed to steal his kindness. At that exact moment, Ethan looked up and smiled awkwardly. "I've been talking far too much. What about you, Victoria? What makes you happy when nobody's watching?" The question caught her completely unprepared. Board members asked about quarterly growth. Journalists asked about market strategy. Investors asked about acquisitions. No one had asked what made her happy in nearly 15 years. She searched for an answer and discovered something unsettling. She honestly didn't know. Victoria lowered her eyes, almost embarrassed by the silence that followed Ethan's question. She searched her memory the way someone searches an old attic, brushing away years of dust, only to realize most of the things she had once loved had quietly disappeared beneath board meetings, earnings reports, and endless flights between cities. "I honestly don't know," she admitted at last. "I used to paint when I was younger. Watercolors mostly. Then the company grew, and somehow I convinced myself there would always be time later." Ethan didn't rush to fill the silence. He simply nodded, as though her answer deserved respect instead of judgment. "Maybe later has been waiting for you longer than you think," he said softly. She looked at him, surprised by the simplicity of the thought. In her world, people solve problems with consultants, strategies, and expensive retreats. Ethan offered a sentence no longer than a breath, and somehow it carried more comfort than years of executive coaching. Their meals had long gone cold, yet neither seemed to notice. Outside, the rain continued tracing silver rivers across the restaurant windows while the city lights shimmered like distant stars struggling through the storm. The elegant dining room buzzed with conversations about mergers, vacations, and stock prices, but at their table time had slowed into something strangely peaceful. Victoria realized she had been smiling for nearly an hour without forcing it. She couldn't remember the last time that had happened. "Can I ask you something?" she said. Ethan leaned back slightly. "Of course. Why did you agree to a blind date?" He chuckled, rubbing the back of his neck. "My neighbor signed me up. Victoria laughed. She what? Mrs. Henderson. She's 74, owns 6 cats, and has decided my daughter deserves a mother before she graduates high school." Victoria laughed harder than she intended, drawing curious glances from nearby tables. Ethan joined her, his own laughter warm and genuine. "She told me," he continued, "you spend all your time fixing everybody else's porch, Ethan. Maybe it's time someone repaired your heart." Victoria's smile softened. "Wise woman." "Very," Ethan agreed, though she also threatened to bake me another raisin casserole if I refused. "That sounds terrifying." "It is. You say yes to blind dates when the alternative is her cooking." They both laughed again, and for a fleeting moment Victoria forgot she was the woman whose signature could move global markets before lunchtime. She felt less like a billionaire and more like someone simply sharing dinner with a man whose presence made the world quieter. Across the room, her executive assistant Claire had just arrived to deliver confidential documents before an overseas video conference. She stopped near the entrance, instantly recognizing Victoria. Her eyes widened when she saw who was sitting across from her. The worn suit, the inexpensive watch, the calloused hands. Claire instinctively reached for her phone to message the security team before Victoria looked up and subtly shook her head. One small gesture. No interruptions. Claire hesitated, then quietly stepped back out into the rain. Ethan never noticed. He was telling Victoria about the tiny treehouse he had promised to build for Lily before summer ended, describing every detail with the excitement of a father planning a castle rather than a few wooden boards. Victoria listened with growing warmth, unaware that outside the restaurant, Claire was already wondering how the most powerful CEO in the country could possibly look happier with a broke carpenter than she ever had beside presidents, celebrities, or billionaires. By the time dessert arrived, the restaurant had begun to empty, leaving behind only the quiet clink of silverware and the soft melody of an old jazz piano drifting through hidden speakers. Neither Ethan nor Victoria had touched the dessert menu. They had discovered something far sweeter than chocolate or cheesecake, the rare comfort of being understood. Ethan glanced at the antique wall clock and sighed almost apologetically. I should probably get going soon. Lily has a rule. Victoria tilted her head. A rule. He smiled, and that familiar warmth returned to his face. No matter how late I work, I have to be home before she falls asleep. If I can't make it, I call and tell her a bedtime story over the phone. Victoria's expression softened. Every night, every single night. He chuckled quietly. She's 8 now, but she still pretends she's not sleepy until she hears my voice. Last night's story involved a squirrel that wanted to become an astronaut. I may be running out of ideas. Victoria laughed gently, imagining the scene. It was such a simple ritual, yet somehow it carried more meaning than every lavish gala she had attended during the past decade. She remembered countless evenings returning to an empty penthouse overlooking Manhattan, greeted only by automated lights and the silence that echoed through rooms too large for one person. She must adore you, Victoria said. Ethan looked down for a brief moment before answering. I hope she remembers that I always tried. The honesty in those words settled quietly between them. There was no performance, no attempt to appear as the perfect father. Just a man doing his best after life had broken him in ways no child should ever have to witness. Before Victoria could respond, Ethan's phone buzzed softly on the table. The cracked screen lit up with a smiling picture of Lily wearing a paper crown made from colored construction paper. Ethan answered immediately. Hey, Peanut. Victoria could hear only the tiny voice giggling through the speaker. Ethan listened more than he talked. Yes, I remembered. Did Mr. Whiskers behave today? That's wonderful. Brush your teeth before Grandma catches you pretending again. He laughed, his eyes glowing with the kind of peace money could never purchase. Then he lowered his voice. I'm on my way home. I wouldn't miss our story for anything. When the call ended, he looked almost embarrassed. Sorry about that. Victoria slowly shook her head. Don't apologize. She hesitated before adding. I think that's the nicest conversation I've overheard in years. Ethan smiled modestly. Kids have a way of reminding us what's actually important. Victoria looked out through the rain-streaked windows, but instead of seeing the glittering skyline that usually filled her with pride, she found herself wondering what it might feel like to have someone waiting at home simply because they loved her, not because they needed her signature. For the first time in years, the empire she had spent her life building felt strangely small compared to the promise Ethan had just made to an 8-year-old girl. And as they stood to leave the restaurant together, neither of them noticed the photographer sitting inside a parked car across the street, quietly lowering his camera after capturing a single photograph that by morning would begin changing both of their lives. The rain had eased into a fine mist by the time Ethan and Victoria stepped outside the restaurant. The city no longer felt loud. Streetlights reflected across the wet pavement like ribbons of gold, and passing cars whispered through shallow puddles instead of roaring past them. Ethan walked her toward the valet area with the easy courtesy of a man who had never confused kindness with obligation. Thank you, Victoria said quietly. For dinner. Ethan smiled. For making me laugh, she corrected. I wasn't expecting that tonight. He slipped both hands into the pockets of his worn coat and shrugged with an almost boyish humility. Neither was I. They stood there for a moment, neither seeming eager to end the evening. Finally, Victoria asked, Would you maybe like to see each other again? Ethan looked genuinely surprised. After tonight? She laughed softly. Is that so hard to believe? He shook his head. Honestly, a little. Before she could answer, a black luxury sedan rolled silently to the curb. Ethan assumed it belonged to another guest, but the driver immediately stepped out and opened a rear door with practiced precision. Good evening, Miss Sterling, he said respectfully. Ethan's eyes shifted toward Victoria. She froze for the briefest moment. Claire had ignored her instruction not to interrupt and had clearly sent the company driver anyway, hoping to avoid unnecessary attention. Victoria offered Ethan an apologetic smile. I should explain. But before she could continue, the driver's phone rang. Without thinking, he answered. Yes, The board meeting has been moved to 7:30 tomorrow morning. Miss Sterling is leaving now. The words hung in the damp night air. Ethan's expression changed, not with anger, but with quiet confusion. Board meeting. Victoria exhaled slowly. There was no graceful escape anymore. Ethan, there's something I didn't tell you. He waited patiently, giving her space to speak. I'm the CEO of Sterling Dynamics. She expected disbelief. Instead, she watched realization slowly settle across his face as pieces fell into place. The tailored confidence she carried without trying, the discreet security he hadn't noticed inside the restaurant, the luxury sedan, the driver's respectful tone. He looked at her for several long seconds before letting out a small breath. Sterling Dynamics, he repeated softly. The technology company? She nodded. Yes. Ethan gave a faint smile, though it no longer carried the carefree warmth of earlier that evening. Well, he said gently, that certainly explains why the waiter looked nervous every time he came to our table. Victoria searched his eyes. Are you upset? He answered honestly, exactly as she had come to expect from him. No. A pause. Just surprised. Another silence settled between them, different from the comfortable ones they had shared over dinner. This one carried uncertainty. Ethan glanced toward the enormous skyline where countless office towers pierced the night. Somewhere among them stood Victoria's empire. Then he looked down at his own weathered hands, rough from years of lifting lumber and shaping wood. You know, he said quietly, I almost didn't come tonight because I couldn't afford a new suit. Victoria felt her heart sink. Ethan, he offered a gentle smile before she could explain herself. You didn't lie about who you are because you wanted to hurt me. I understand that. He took one slow step backward, but maybe our worlds are a little farther apart than either of us realized. Before Victoria could find the words to stop him, Ethan thanked her once more for a wonderful evening, turned toward his old pickup truck parked beneath a flickering street lamp, and drove away into the quiet night, leaving Victoria standing beside her waiting limousine with a feeling she had never experienced after closing a billion-dollar deal. For the first time in years, losing one ordinary man felt infinitely more frightening than losing an entire fortune. Victoria remained standing beside the waiting limousine long after Ethan's old pickup had disappeared into the rain-soaked streets. The driver quietly closed the rear door, but she made no move to get inside. For the first time in years, the cold night air felt more honest than the climate-controlled comfort of the luxury car waiting behind her. Claire stepped out from the front passenger seat, tablet in hand, already reviewing tomorrow's schedule. Your Tokyo investors confirmed the morning conference call. The Zurich acquisition team needs your signature before noon, and Bloomberg requested an interview regarding the merger. Victoria didn't answer. Her eyes were still fixed on the empty road where Ethan had driven away. Claire hesitated. Miss Sterling? Victoria finally spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. Did you know? Claire looked confused. Know what? That he had no idea who I was. Claire lowered her eyes. I assumed he recognized you. Victoria gave a sad smile. That's exactly the point. He didn't. During the drive back to her Manhattan penthouse, neither woman spoke. Towering skyscrapers rushed past the windows like silent monuments to everything Victoria had spent her adult life building. Normally, the glittering skyline filled her with pride. Tonight, it only reminded her how high she had climbed and how lonely the view had become. When the elevator doors opened directly into her private residence on the top floor, the familiar silence greeted her once again. The marble floors reflected soft, recessed lighting. Modern artwork worth millions decorated the walls. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the entire city, yet there was not a single voice waiting to ask how her evening had gone. She slipped off her heels, walked barefoot across the polished floor, and stopped before an old wooden easel tucked away in a forgotten corner of the living room. A thin layer of dust covered the unfinished watercolor she had abandoned nearly 15 years earlier, the last painting she had touched before becoming CEO after her father's sudden passing. She gently brushed the dust away with her fingertips. Ethan's words echoed quietly inside her mind. Maybe later has been waiting for you longer than you think. She swallowed hard. Meanwhile, 200 miles away in the quiet town of Willow Creek, Ethan eased his aging pickup into the gravel driveway of his small white farmhouse. Before he could even turn off the engine, the front door burst open. Lily raced across the porch in pink pajamas, her paper crown still slightly crooked on her curls. "Daddy!" she shouted as Ethan scooped her into his arms. "You made it before bedtime." He held her tightly, breathing in the familiar scent of baby shampoo and crayons. "I told you I would." From the porch, Mrs. Henderson smiled knowingly before disappearing back inside to wash the dishes she had insisted on cleaning. Ethan carried Lily into the house, read her the promised bedtime story about the squirrel who finally reached the moon in a homemade rocket, tucked the blankets around her shoulders, and kissed her forehead goodnight. After she drifted off to sleep, he sat alone on the porch swing beneath a sky filled with quiet stars. He thought about Victoria's smile, the way she had laughed at his terrible jokes, and the sadness that had briefly appeared in her eyes whenever she forgot to hide it. Then he looked down at his rough hands and slowly shook his head. "People like her belong in another world," he whispered to the night. But at that exact moment, hundreds of miles away, Victoria Sterling stood before the same moon outside her penthouse window, holding the business card Ethan had forgotten on the restaurant table, silently wondering how she could possibly convince the only man who had never cared about her fortune that he had already become the richest part of her life. The next morning, Victoria Sterling did something that shocked everyone who worked for her. At precisely 7:30, she entered the executive boardroom overlooking Manhattan, where 12 directors were already waiting with quarterly reports, acquisition contracts, and projections worth billions of dollars. Usually she commanded the room before saying a single word. Today, however, her attention drifted toward the rain sliding down the enormous glass windows. She heard presentations about international expansion, artificial intelligence investments, and record-breaking profits. Yet none of the numbers seemed capable of competing with the memory of a man smiling as he described building a blue birdhouse for his daughter. "Ms. Sterling," the chief financial officer asked carefully, "should we move forward with the Phoenix acquisition?" Victoria blinked, realizing everyone was staring at her. "Table it until next week," she replied calmly. A wave of confusion swept across the room. Delaying a deal worth nearly $2 billion was unlike her. When the meeting finally ended, Claire hurried after her. "You've never postponed an acquisition without reviewing every document." Victoria kept walking. "People can wait a week." Claire hesitated before quietly asking, "Is this about Ethan Brooks?" Victoria stopped beside the elevator and smiled sadly. "It's about realizing I've spent 15 years building a company while quietly forgetting how to build a life." Meanwhile, in Willow Creek, Ethan's day had begun long before sunrise. He dropped Lily off at school with the same gentle reminder to be kind to everyone, then headed toward a small farmhouse where an elderly widow needed her front porch repaired before the weekend. He worked steadily beneath the warm morning sun, replacing weatherboards one by one. Around noon, the old woman carried out 2 glasses of lemonade and sat beside him. "You look distracted," she observed. Ethan chuckled softly. "Doi. I've been 90 years old for almost 6 months," she replied with a mischievous grin. "I can recognize a man who's thinking about a woman." Ethan laughed despite himself. "It's complicated. The best ones usually are." He leaned against the porch railing, looking across the fields stretching beyond the property. "She lives in a completely different world." The widow nodded thoughtfully. "Does she treat you differently because of yours?" Ethan considered the question. He remembered Victoria laughing over Mrs. Henderson's raisin casserole, listening carefully whenever he spoke about Lily, and thanking every restaurant employee before they left. Finally he answered, "No." "Then maybe," the old woman said gently, "the different world only exists inside your own head." Hundreds of miles away, Victoria found herself opening the drawer of her office desk instead of reviewing contracts. Inside lay Ethan's forgotten business card, its edges slightly worn, the simple words Brooks Custom Woodworks printed above a small phone number. No title, no awards, no promises, just a name and an honest profession. She traced the card lightly with her thumb before making a decision that every member of her executive team would have called irrational. She canceled the remainder of her meetings, ignored Claire's horrified expression, picked up her car keys instead of calling for the company driver, and quietly began the 3-hour drive toward Willow Creek, determined not to arrive as the billionaire CEO the world admired, but simply as the woman who hoped one ordinary single father might still give her a second chance. The afternoon sun was beginning its slow descent when Victoria's black SUV rolled into Willow Creek, its polished finish looking almost out of place beside weathered barns, white fences, and fields glowing gold beneath the summer sky. She drove slowly through the quiet town, passing children riding bicycles, neighbors waving from front porches, and pickup trucks parked outside the local diner. No one recognized the billionaire behind the steering wheel. For the first time in years, she was grateful for that. Guided only by the address on Ethan's business card, she finally turned onto a narrow gravel road lined with old maple trees. At the end stood a modest white farmhouse with a wooden porch, flower boxes beneath the windows, and a half-finished treehouse rising beside a giant oak. Laughter drifted through the warm evening air. Victoria stepped out of the SUV just as Ethan lifted a wooden plank into place while Lily, wearing safety goggles far too large for her face, proudly handed him a hammer. "Daddy, is this where the telescope goes?" she asked excitedly. Ethan smiled. "Exactly there, Peanut." He turned to reach for another board and froze. Victoria stood quietly at the edge of the yard, wearing simple jeans, a light sweater, and no jewelry except the small silver watch she had worn the night they met. There were no bodyguards, no assistants, no photographers, just her. Lily noticed the stranger first. "Daddy." Ethan slowly climbed down from the ladder. Neither spoke for several seconds. Finally, Victoria broke the silence. "I wasn't sure you'd want to see me." Ethan looked at the long driveway behind her. "You came alone." She nodded. "I wanted you to meet me, not my company." Another quiet pause settled between them. Then Victoria took one careful step forward. "I spent years believing success meant people needing me," she said softly. "Then one evening, I met a man who never needed anything from me except honesty." Her voice trembled for the first time. "I should have trusted you with the truth from the beginning. I'm sorry." Ethan lowered his eyes for a moment before looking back at her. "I wasn't hurt because you're a billionaire." He smiled gently. "I was hurt because for one wonderful evening, I thought we were simply Ethan and Victoria." Tears gathered in her eyes. "Can we still be?" Before Ethan could answer, Lily quietly walked over and slipped her small hand into Victoria's. She looked up with the fearless honesty only children possess. "Daddy says people who tell the truth after they're scared are still brave." Victoria blinked away a tear and smiled at the little girl. Ethan laughed softly, shaking his head. "She gets wiser every year." He stepped closer until only a few feet separated them. "I was wrong about something," he admitted. "I kept saying we lived in different worlds." Victoria Watif. "But maybe—" He glanced toward the unfinished treehouse, the old farmhouse, and Lily smiling between them. "Maybe home isn't a world. Maybe it's a person." Victoria could no longer hold back the tears. Without thinking, she closed the distance and wrapped her arms around him. Ethan embraced her just as gently, not because she was the richest woman in the country, but because she was simply the woman standing in front of him. Around them, the evening breeze stirred the leaves of the old oak tree, while Lily clapped her hands and declared, "Now our treehouse needs one more window." They both laughed through their tears. Months later, headlines across the nation would speculate endlessly about why Victoria Sterling had turned down another record-breaking merger, why she spent more weekends in a tiny farming town than inside Manhattan boardrooms, and why the world's most admired so suddenly looked happier than ever before. The financial analysts never found the answer because it couldn't be measured on a balance sheet. The greatest investment Victoria Sterling ever made was not in technology, real estate, or global markets. It was in a quiet single father who taught her that dignity is richer than status, kindness outlives wealth, and the truest fortune a person can ever possess is coming home to the people, who love them exactly as they are.